Hi, my name is Barry Horner, and I'm your host on today's episode of Stake and Soul, the podcast that's dedicated to demystifying the world of employee ownership. Stake refers not just to the financial or beneficial ownership, but also to the vested interest, the sense of responsibility, and the feeling of belonging that comes with being an employee owner. Soul is all about company culture, the values, the shared purpose, and the human connection that are amplified and shaped by employee ownership. Soul is the company's silent language. Join us for Series 1 as we sit down with business leaders and CEOs who have successfully navigated their journey to employee ownership. Today, I'm delighted to introduce you to a familiar face in employee ownership circles, Arabella Lewis-Smith. Bella is the founder and managing director of Salad Creative, a brand, digital and design agency based on the south coast of the UK. She founded the company in 2001 and has since been the driving force behind its growth. Bella's leadership style is defined by her people-centric approach and a focus on building an inclusive culture. In 2021, she made the pivotal decision to transition the company to 100% employee-owned. This move, she has stated, was driven by a desire to preserve Salad's unique culture and to benefit the team members who helped her build the business. Beyond her role at Salad, Bella is a vocal advocate for modern leadership and employee ownership. She is a guest lecturer at universities and a mentor to young business leaders, championing sustainable business practices and a more empathetic approach to management. More recently, she has become the independent director of 2 leading EO businesses.
Hi, Bella. Nice to have you on Stake and Soul podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Barry. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's always lovely to talk to you.
Great. Thank you. Well, why don't we dive in? It's good probably just to go back a little bit, just to understand a little bit about you, your business. So take us back to maybe not quite the start, but the sort of how Salad emerged, where you saw, I guess, the gap in the market. There's quite a few businesses that do, I guess, what you do, but there must have been something that you spotted and you thought, I can fill a gap here. There's no one doing it quite like we're doing it. So yeah, just a little bit background about you and the business, and then we can jump more into what then led you to becoming employee owned.
Okay. I think the thing that drove the business in the beginning was probably 2 things. And the first was this desire to do really beautiful, exceptional creative work. That's always been at our kind of core of the business. And we're 24 years in now. So it was
Okay.
true on day one. And it's absolutely still in our core and in our hearts right now. But I think the other thing, and this it was perhaps naive actually at the time, but I worked with my former business partner in another business in, of all things, the motor racing sector.
Okay.
And we were dealing with agencies, with creative agencies and marketing agencies, and we felt a lot of frustration, and we felt like we could do it better. And I think the naivety came from the sense that actually, once you get into it, you realize all the things that you don't know, and we probably made all the same mistakes in those early years. But it was those 2 factors, I think, that really, sparked the idea and drove us to set up the business.
Yeah. And then tell us a little bit about the growth. Was it just you and a business partner on day one? Have you grown organically, inorganically? How have you got to where you got to now, which then you must have got to the point where you think, actually, what does the future look like? What does succession look like? So what was the journey? You started 24 years ago. Just walk us through that a little bit, just to give us some context.
Yeah, so I think when we started, we were very much a creative agency, sort of specializing in branding and graphic design services. And we've always grown organically. And it's been a sort of slow and steady journey in terms of that growth path, with sort of perhaps some more spurts in terms of that growth than others. And but what I would say is that starting back then, in terms of that creative core, what we've done is we've built out from there. So fast forward to today, we are a creative business that still specialises in brand. Brand is absolutely at our core. So, and what that actually means is helping businesses and organisations to communicate more effectively with their customers and target customers. And then, so we start with that brand piece. So that's the value proposition, messaging, vision, mission, values, tone of voice, aspects like that. And then the next area that we help businesses with is the visual identity. So that's very much the creative articulation of all that strategic work and that foundational work that is it's in every business inherently, but it might not necessarily have been drawn out, distilled, defined, and agreed and shared across the organization, depending on the sort of maturity and scale of the organization. And then the third piece in terms of what we do now is we take those two elements and we articulate them on what is often the most important branded touch point of any organization, which is the website.
Right.
So those are the three core pillars to the business now. So it's still very much rooted in what we started with in 2001, but that's where we've evolved to organically, as you say, and very carefully, adding those strategic pieces over the years as we've grown.
Sure. And how many are you now? Are you single site, or what's the sort of breadth of the business?
We are single site, really.
Yeah.
I mean, we are, since COVID, we've been hybrid, but we're predominantly based on the south coast. So our office is in Poole in Dorset. We've always been very busy up and down on the train to London over the years, although I would say less so these days since the advent of so much more that we can do on video calls.
Sure.
And there are 10 of us.
10.
So,
Okay.
and we describe ourselves as a consciously small senior team. So we've been bigger in the past, and we've really found quite a sweet spot, I think, in terms of who we are, the size we are, the way that we work. We're a very well-oiled machine, and in many ways, we've actually had almost a sort of anti-growth mindset in the last 5 years or so. Certainly in terms of headcount, we've found something that works really well. It works for us. It works for our clients. And so when it comes to that growth piece that, so often we talk about as business leaders,
Yeah.
for us, we very much think of that in terms of a sort of mindful ambition. So it's not about ruthless growth or, that sort of messy growth that we've been on before too. It's a very, very considered and careful sort of strategic growth that we're looking to.
So is that more quality over quantity in terms of when you say measured growth?
I think it's the right kind of growth. It's not. I think you'll often hear people say, if you're not growing, you're going backwards or you're dying. And I get that on the one hand, but I think when it comes to the culture of a business and a business having an environment that is both great for the team, for the people within that business, but also, of course, as a result, really, really positive for clients and their experiences, then I think there's a reason then to not just pursue growth. Typically we're pursuing growth because we're looking to scale the business to sell, for example, or of course, all businesses need to make a profit to survive and invest. So we're not anti-profit, but I think when it comes to growth, particularly in terms of headcount, we're just very cautious in terms of how we do that. We've got an incredible team who work very, very well together. We've got a really, really good record of length of service. And so bringing anybody new into that is just very carefully considered. And I don't think that's unusual in many ways, but it's, as I say, it's the opposite end of that kind of ruthless growth, that messy growth that so often also can be huge success. It's just not how we're doing it.
Yeah, you haven't got some PE house sat behind the scenes saying, you need to produce a 10x return or whatever it might be. So that I completely get that. That makes complete sense. When you were talking about branding, my mind just went to, obviously this is an EO podcast. If you were working with a company like Paradigm Norton or another EO business, does does branding look differently in a neo business, or should it?
That's a great question. And we do work with employee owned businesses. And what was interesting about when we transitioned to employee ownership and we started to immerse ourselves in the world of EO and met so many incredible people and businesses that we were like, oh my gosh, we found our
Mm,
tribe,
sure.
actually, we
Yeah.
thought. Um, and it struck us that when it comes to brand projects in particular, so looking at that strategic aspect to a brand, what is it? Who is a business? Who are they for? What do they stand for? What do they believe in? Their values, their characteristics. It felt more important for employee-owned businesses than ever to invest in that area to us, but to do it as much as possible in an inclusive way for the
Sure.
team, to bring the team in. Now, of course, depending on the size of the business, that's that's easier or more difficult. But we have worked with a business, for example, that had over 200 employees, and they engaged every single one of those employees in workshops
Wow.
in terms of developing that in particular. That piece was about values, but it's very much intrinsically linked with the holistic brand. So it does depend on the organization, but I think you know it's just good business to invest in this stuff. It doesn't have to be exclusive for employee owned businesses, but there somehow feels like a greater obligation for employee owned businesses to engage a more inclusive process
Yeah.
in investing in brand.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting and helpful. Thank you. So that sort of brings us a little bit up to date. Rationale for why you set it up, some of the around the numbers and the people you work for and the type of work you do. What prompted the succession conversation even before you maybe thought EO was the answer? What was the catalyst for you or the business that made you think actually we do need to be on a journey of discovery, looking at various succession options?
Well, I'll tell you the story of how sort of employee ownership came about, I suppose. So in 2014, I bought out my business partner and brought in a consultant, wrote a new business plan, and it had never really been on the agenda before. But in that business plan, we set the ultimate goal to grow the business to sell, which I think is pretty typical,
Mm.
in terms
Mm.
of we're looking for something that we're working towards, and we set about that path for growth, the sort of wiggly path for growth, um, and fast forward to 2019, my co-director and I were in a board meeting, and he asked me what it was in hindsight a real light bulb moment question, and that was, how much do we really want this? And
Okay.
both of us, I think, when he said that, I think we both immediately knew that that ultimate goal didn't feel very authentic for us. So we were absolutely scaling. We were on that path, but we'd almost forgotten why, because we never spoke about that ultimate goal. And in that conversation, he said, "I've heard about something called employee ownership," and we agreed to investigate and find out more. And we went to see an expert, a great guy called Chris Budd, who had transitioned his business to employee ownership and then gone on to become a consultant in that space. And he'd written a book and he'd started a course. And we went to see him, and he was very helpful and he sort of explained the basics to us. And in that conversation, we just immediately knew this is what we want to do. This feels really, really right for us. On a personal level, I suppose that was very much about having something that we were working towards that felt like that goal, and I guess in some ways felt like an end, because I think when you run a business, and perhaps more so than others, a small business, there you can't leave. You're not like a salaried
Sure.
employee and you
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
I'm done with this, I'm going to go and get a different job. It's much more difficult to do that. And over the years, I had certainly looked at, could we bring in a new MD? Could we, could I look at that succession piece? whilst I was still majority owner.
Mm,
And I think the conclusion I and we came to was that that wouldn't work for our business,
right.
and that we had seen other examples where that had failed, and it just didn't feel right to, in a way, hand over the responsibility, but not necessarily the benefit
Sure.
that
And
comes from it.
did you explore other options? You said you started looking at employee ownership, and that became very quickly emerged as like the front runner. Did you actually look at alternatives, or was the rationale for employee ownership so compelling that it was almost like it's not worth doing anything else? This is the thing for us.
I definitely think it was about, excuse me, it was absolutely about that compelling rationale. That was 100%. You know, our it captured us. That conversation absolutely kind of it just the philosophy of it, the ethos of it, the win-win really captured our imagination, and we thought this is perfect for us. In terms of other options that we looked at, I mean, we had, you know, over the years had various people contacting us, you know, with initial inquiries about inquiring us. Um, we had considered, is there anybody in the business who'd like to do an MBO? Um, and the answer to that was no at the time.
Sure.
And I think those acquisition conversations just didn't really feel like they were
Right.
going to. Yeah, they didn't
Yeah.
feel right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So at some point you have a board meeting or whatever it was and go, we're going to do this. Where did you start in the journey to think about finding professional advisors, how you actually go about the whole thing? Because I know when we transitioned, I mean, that which was 2019, I think the market's a bit more mature than it was then, but
Mm.
it was a real challenge to know who to go to. EO only really came in 2014, so it was still for us early days, and definitely there were a number of, for example, law firms out there with expertise. But when we got down to it and we did a sort of short list of professional advisors, many of them had done relatively few transactions. So, what was it like for you in that period? How did you go about choosing advisors? And yeah,
So we contacted the EOA. So we knew about the EOA, and I can't remember. So we were we were 21, and I can't remember the exact, you know, every last detail, but I'm pretty sure we got some recommendations from the EOA,
right,
and we went to and we got a short list, but that also included our law firm, who
right,
we knew and trusted, and
yeah,
knew, you know, and had a really good relationship with, knew that they knew us. Um, and in the end, I think we just didn't know what we didn't know at that time. And, you know, one of the biggest mistakes I made was I didn't, apart from that conversation with Chris, who had transitioned his business, I didn't speak to a single other employee owned business about their
oh, okay,
experience.
that's interesting. Yeah,
And I didn't know any. And I
right,
guess the only one I knew was probably John Lewis. And that
yeah,
felt like it was so sort of different in terms of scale, and sort of unapproachable anyway in that
mm,
way. Um, so we didn't have the opportunity to have conversations and say, you know, how did you do it? How did you know? So we so in the end, I think these other advisors felt so cold to us that we ended up going with the law firm that knew us, which wasn't necessarily a specialist in employee ownership, although they didn't do a bad job, you
mm,
know. But I
sure,
think hindsight, now that I am so much more knowledgeable
mm,
and met so many more of the advisors that are out there in the sector, I can imagine that we would have had a different experience having gone to a specialist. And you know, it wasn't a problem necessarily, but it potentially it could have been an elevated experience, but I'll never know.
yeah. What with the benefit of that hindsight, what would your advice be to firms that are researching transitioning to employee ownership? And you've mentioned the EOA, clearly an excellent resource there. Any other tips or thoughts as to about how you'd go about, what would you do differently? You've said try and speak to a few other EO businesses. Is there anything else that you think, actually, I don't know why I didn't do that? That would have been a good thing to do.
I think it's mostly speaking to other businesses or other founders. I think, and it's partly how we've met and why I've enjoyed our conversations so much. You know, the Employee Ownership Founders Club is quite small, and we've been through quite a specific experience that it's really I really enjoy speaking to other founders, and almost crave it actually. And so that would absolutely be the thing that I would do differently. And the one thing I would say is that what we've discovered is that the employee owned community is incredibly generous,
Yeah.
and um, and so I guess, and not knowing that at the time, I just wouldn't have perhaps, had the audacity, it would have felt like, to sort
Yeah, I
of
know what you
reach out to
mean.
somebody else in
Yeah.
the employee-owned space and say,
Yeah.
"Oh, you don't know me, but can I speak to you about your experience?" But actually,
Yeah.
now that I know what I do, I'm pretty sure that I would have had some fantastic conversations that would have been really insightful. Um, and we have overwhelmingly had a really good experience of transitioning the business to employee ownership. It doesn't mean we haven't made mistakes,
Sure.
but it has been a very positive experience in the main. But I just think we could have accelerated that. We could have done it better. There are, yeah, I'm sure, a number of things that we would have learnt in those early days, having had conversations with others.
Yeah.
That, as it happened, we just learnt after we transitioned.
Yeah, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, within the financial planning community, I think that's quite unusual in that there's a huge level of sharing, which I think is quite different to the legal and accounting profession. And it's something I really enjoyed, that sort of just shared knowledge, shared best practice. But coming into the EO community, which is a really small group, the preparedness for people to go, this is what I do, how I do it, and that level of debate and dialogue, I think is just amazing. Yeah.
Mm.
So no, completely agree with you on that. So you've had your board decision, you've appointed professional advisors to guide you through the process. You get to the date of transition, you've become employee owned, or perhaps even a bit before that. What was the process you went through? And I think this is a really interesting one because I was at an EO event the other day where a firm mentioned that they'd actually told their team a week after they'd become employee owned. We told our team at least 12 months before we were going employee owned. It was like, we're selling the business to you. How do you feel about it? What was your communication plan? And I guess coming from your professional background in terms of good communication, what does good communication look like? If you, again, I'm not sure whether you would be of the view you did it perfectly. We all learn along the way. But if you could do it again, or however you did do it, what does good look like, do you think, in terms of communicating that change and getting that almost owner mindset from before the transaction and you're sort of transitioning pre-transaction almost? Just talk us through a little bit about that. That would be helpful.
Well, if I can start with sharing the process that we went through.
Yeah.
So, in 2019, we had the conversation with Chris Budd. One of the really wise pieces of advice that he shared in that conversation, because I guess he probably saw how positive we were feeling about it, perhaps excited we were, is do not rush back and tell your team straight away. And that was a really, really good advice, because I think I've always had quite um, an honest approach in
Mm-hmm.
terms of my leadership style, and wanting to be as kind of open and communicative as possible. So that was some good advice. So we didn't rush back and tell the team in 2019. And what we did do is we started his course, which he was running, I think at the time. I'm not sure if he still does. Anyway, I guess later in that year, there were some other things going on, fires to fight, whatever, and it felt like this investing at this time in this course was perhaps a bit of a nice to have at that time, because it was very much about preparedness for,
Right.
for transitioning to EO. We put that to one side, focused on sort of matters in hand. And then, of course, early 2020, COVID happened.
Mm.
And at that time, obviously lots and lots of things go up in the air, and certainly did for us. And what actually happened was, I really questioned, in that early period whether I wanted to even continue with the business. It was the first time I really thought, is this something that I want to, am I done, basically? And my co-director, Andy, kind of talked me back in a way from that position one morning, and he said, "What would it take for you to love this business again?"
Great
Um,
question.
and he's full of great questions. He's such a wonderful colleague. And in that conversation, we agreed that we would restructure, but also that we'd get that employee ownership thing back on the table.
Right.
And I guess partly because of everything being so different at that time, and this, and I really felt like I sort of moved to a place of quite radical honesty. Maybe I just needed to do that in
Mm,
order to continue,
mm.
as leader of the business, and to sort of, um, and so what I did do is fairly early on in 2020, let's say it was about May 2020, is I shared with the team. It was actually on the beach over pizza. Um,
Nice.
it was it was our intention to take the business employee owned. So it wasn't a this is happening, in 2 weeks or 3 months or whatever. It was sharing the intention. But what it also wasn't was a full presentation in terms of what that meant. And in hindsight, where that didn't work so well was, of course, people's minds just immediately went to, what does that mean for me? I know somebody shared later that their thought was, I can't, they imagined me leaving. I can't imagine the business without you, Bella.
Right.
And so what we did thereafter is we quite quickly followed up by gathering all the questions and thoughts and fears that people had,
Mhm.
um, and then preparing a presentation that we delivered to the team, let's say a month later or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
that. So I think in hindsight, I would have been a bit more prepared in terms of allaying those fears, if you like, or
Mm.
anxiety, or those questions of how does it work? What does it mean for me? Um, and actually, that conversation at the beach to transition was almost a year. So we transitioned in April 21. So like you, and I wouldn't quite describe it as a consultation, because I don't think it is us saying, "Do you want to buy this business?" It is sharing an intention, keeping people informed along the way, and and allowing people to ask questions and feel like they are consulted in that respect.
Sure. That's really interesting. In terms of, you've explained the initial communication, which was probably relatively brief, but gave them a sort of flavor of what you were doing, and then a more detailed one. I think it's really interesting how you get that communication piece right. I've seen some presentations that a number of firms do, and I think that there is no perfect solution, but if you give them too much, they just get totally overwhelmed with, I can't quite remember what Bella said. You give them too little. And as you immediately say, people will always internalize that and think, what does that mean for me? And it's such an unusual concept as well, employee ownership. I think, people are more familiar with a trade sale or whatever, or a merging of a business. So trying to get that right, I think, for EO businesses is a real challenge. The only thing I would say is, don't leave it to the last minute. Make sure you do get that comms plan in place. And like you say, have a whole series of meetings. I like your idea of frequently asked questions. We did exactly the same. So going out to the firm, there's a lot for you to absorb here, but coming back with some really informed, sensible questions. Whatever you're thinking, your colleagues are probably thinking the same question. So, every question that can be asked, let's get that down. And so, yeah, I think 12 months is great. A week before, not so good. So the
I couldn't
T,
agree more. Yeah, no, I
yeah,
really agree. And I think the other thing that I've learned since that, or over this process, to your point, is about repeating information.
mhm,
And this is such an unusual concept
yeah,
if you've never encountered it before. What do you mean I don't own shares? Or what
yeah,
what how does it work? Like, and I think a lot of people looking into employee owned businesses make that assumption too,
yeah,
but for those who are um, employees, it's really important that we communicate well and clearly and frequently, but also that we take into account people's different communication
yeah,
preferences. And I think there are people who absolutely, the PowerPoint or the team presentation work really, really well, but others actually just really need a one to one.
Yeah.
And so it's being sensitive to to making sure people feel like they can talk about this topic, that they can ask the dumb questions or share their fears or confusion, and that's okay.
Yeah, my mind went to we use insights. I don't know if you do in your business, and I think that's quite a thinking about what does a if you're communicating some information, what does the blue person want? Well, I
Mm.
guess a big spreadsheet or lots of words and numbers. If you're yellow and greens, it's more and interestingly, this presentation that a firm I've been working with just sent me, it was a real combination of that, of the detail, but also some really helpful graphics around what does it actually mean. Because as you say, you start looking at things like we're going to put a trust in place. Well, what is one of those? No, you don't have shares. You have beneficial ownership. What the heck is beneficial ownership? So there is a lot to unpack.
Mm.
So, but I think we're both in agreement that actually doing it in a measured way over a period of time, taking into account people's communication preferences, is really key.
The other thing I think with that is just acknowledging that this takes time.
Sure.
I think we're very, just human beings are. We're impatient. We think we've got to move on to the next thing. And what I've learned about employee ownership over our 4.5-ish years that we've now been EO is that this is a constant evolving journey
Yeah.
that we're on, and there is always something new.
Yeah.
And there's always the next thing that we need to invest in um, or consider or change. And I mean, I think that's business in some ways, but there is something really quite specific about the cultural piece
Yeah.
culture and engagement piece from an employee ownership perspective that is constantly evolving, and some of it is complex and does need to take the time that it takes in terms of sort of embedding that information and knowledge into the team.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. I often think of it, you've got your transaction, then there's a transition, and then there's a transformation. In fact, I've just you receiving my EO know-how blogs. I've just written one on that, and it is that it's the the transaction at the start is the starting process. If you can start transition before that, so in a sense that starts 12 months before when you start educating people and informing them, but then there is that transformation process that does take a long time, and I think again that's where shared knowledge is really important. So
Mm.
we've talked quite a bit about the business. What led you up to the decision to make the decision to go down and become employee owned? How did that feel for you as someone who's led the business, been really instrumental in, I guess, molding it, shaping it, setting the culture? Suddenly, I'm just really interested in getting into your head as to where you were at from a mindset shift, because I think it takes a certain entrepreneur owner to be prepared to let go, and it suits some people but it doesn't suit others. So it'd be just interesting just to segue slightly into how you were feeling at that time, and how you've, I guess, coped with it since, and what's been the good and the not so good along this journey post EO.
Well, I think in terms of that initial motivation to take the business employee owned, what I loved was this sense of the win-win. That I get to realise some value from the business I put 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears into. That I have got that end that feels like it's some you've got to. I felt like I needed to know that there was an end, because otherwise I felt like I would be doing this for my whole life,
Right.
and that didn't that didn't feel good.
Sure.
Um, but having said that, what's interesting is I have always loved this business. It's not like I was done with this business. It wasn't like I was sick of it, or it was much more that I just wanted to know that there was, I guess, light at the end of the tunnel in terms of doing other things. And so my message to the team and the world, well, anybody who's listens is is not that I don't love this business and what we do and my role, but I want the opportunity to do other things. So that looks to me like not being MD and not being full time.
Mhm.
I think there is a scenario going forward where, well, there's probably two paths for us. The first is that I work for Salad for the rest of my life, but not as MD and not full time. And that could be a really lovely thing for the business if it still has use for me and value in terms of what I bring, and likewise for me in terms of my contribution. But I think the other road is that we bring in new leadership, um, and I sort of, either there's a sort of scenario where I can't stop meddling, or
Mm.
I'm still de facto MD, and I think in that case I have to go, and we're not there yet. We're not at
Right.
that particular crossroads, or that hasn't emerged. And it is funny when you said, how do you feel about letting go? And the little voice in my head is like, well, I haven't let go, And one of the things I got wrong was, well, I got lots wrong, but I imagined going into this initially that we'd borrow the money.
Right.
And I don't think it's impossible to borrow money to fund an EOT
Mm.
sale, but it was harder 4.5 years ago than it is now. Um, and actually, probably interest rates were so punitive that it wouldn't have we wouldn't have felt comfortable with that rate. Um, so our route has been deferred consideration,
Mm.
and which is fine, and
Yeah.
that's all working very well. So I guess the first thing I thought was borrow the money, and I guess maybe linked to that, but probably just again, in some ways about my naivety or just lack of understanding of what this is going to look like on the other side. I thought I'd be part time within a year.
Right. Okay.
And here I am, 4.5 years in, and I'm not part time.
Interesting, Bella, that you sort of articulated a couple of options for you. One could be, for example, you just carry on. You clearly love what you do. You're clearly doing a brilliant job for your clients. That's one scenario. The other scenario is you look around and think, actually, there is a few other things I'd quite like to do. You get your bucket list out from time to time and think, you know, however long that is. Where are you at on that journey at the moment, and what would be the catalyst for change? Because I guess it's not going to happen until you formally make a decision. So what might lead you into that decision to go, do you know what, enough's enough? Because I guess then you've got the whole leadership transition program and how you then train people up. Just interested to unpack that a little bit if you're happy to share that.
Yeah, I think in terms of the next few years ahead of us, we have got one great opportunity and one great challenge, if you like. And that great opportunity is financial freedom, which we're aiming for in early 28, if not before. And the great challenge is succession. And the 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 thing that we need to do is find a new leader or leaders who
Mm-hmm.
are going to take on the responsibility of running the business and taking it forward into whatever its next chapter is without me as MD. And what's interesting about that is it is. I mean, when you're a leader, you're constantly doing things you're underqualified for, you've never done before. But this is my big one right
Right.
now. I've never been through this process before.
Mm.
Um, Partly, actually, what's interesting about it is for years I've probably, in some ways undervalued what I did, or couldn't perhaps describe what I do. And now that that's coming into focus in terms of what do we need in terms of new leadership in the business, and so it's really trying to um, define what that looks like. Except, of course, it's not going to look like me. It's going to be different.
Yeah.
But try and find the right person or people that are going to take us onto that next into the next chapter, either with me as
Yeah.
part of that or without. And that is, it's a topic we regularly talk about at board meetings. It's a topic we share with the team in terms of, everybody knows that this is something that is on the agenda. As I've said, I've been quite honest with the team about my ultimate plan.
Mm.
But equally, and I think this just speaks to the person that I am and how I work. For me, it is all about finding the right person or people. And in many ways, I will take the time it takes.
Yeah.
You know, I don't have a cut-off point, where it has to happen by this point. I guess I had sort of loosely linked succession with financial freedom. Um, but I think if we had the solution right now, I'd be very, very happy to step aside. You know, I really feel like salad has afforded me a beautiful life. I mean, I have, of course, worked very hard to make that happen, but I'm so grateful to this business for what the life it's afforded me and provided me, that I've won salad. So if we get the new person or people in right now, then I'd be happy to step aside. Equally, if it takes longer than early 28, then it takes longer, and I'm okay with that too. So I think that's my mindset. Having said that, if I think there is an argument to say, if there was something that was pulling me away from the business, a new opportunity, a new passion, a new thing, then that's another reason why I would go. Now it's not there at the moment. Having said that, I've just got my first two new jobs, so I now am external trustee for two other employee-owned
Excellent.
businesses, which I'm really
Yeah.
excited about and really
Yeah.
enjoying so
Brilliant.
far. So I think that's the beginning for me
Yeah.
of next chapter of this
Next.
kind of portfolio life that I'm looking for,
Sure.
which may or may not include salad in the future.
Yeah.
Um, but yes, I think and I'm sure many of my colleagues are so frustrated with my sort of flexibility in this way, but it really is about putting salad first and just trying to deliver what it needs for the future and being flexible around that personally.
Sure. Your journey and what you've thank you for being so honest and candid about where you're at. That really resonates with me because I mean you're younger than me, but for a long time my flexibility actually got in the way of things. And it was only when we took on a non-exec director who said, when do you want to make some changes, Barry? When do you want to retire? And I haven't retired, and I've got my new lease of life doing these sorts of things. And every board meeting, it was like the date kept on moving and moving. And at some point, they did say, the board, we do need to have a plan in place. And I agreed that we can't just let it roll forever. And actually, what was really helpful for us is we brought in an external consultant to help guide us through the whole process, and definitely recommend that. So we weren't sure whether, again, we would have someone internally who could take over, whether we'd need to recruit or what we'd need to do. Now, in the end, it transpired it was another non-exec director that we brought in who was a lawyer who's done a sort of career shift, and it's worked out brilliantly well. And we've now done that transition. But definitely, I think at some point you have to say you can't carry on forever and sort of put a marker down and then think about what that sort of plan would be. Because if it is an internal succession, there's quite a lot of training that needs to go into that, and that doesn't happen overnight, which I'm sure you've recognised. That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. That really brings us sort of up to date in terms of what you've just shared. Really, is how you felt about the transition. Thinking about your new employee owners, how did it land with them? I guess as we've discussed, there's a big learning curve for them. But if I had them on the podcast today, what would their reflections be of the journey and where they're at now?
I mean, I think first of all, it's of course individual for each person, and of course we've only got a small team,
Sure.
so I mean, I think in general, people felt like it was positive. I think there was certainly a bit of anxiety about the unknown. What does
Mm-hmm.
this mean? And
Yeah.
so that took some time to communicate and sort of allay any concerns.
Yeah.
We did have one person in the business who was very sceptical, and he probably he's spoken about it publicly anyway, but he was probably more like, oh, this sounds like a bit of a tax dodge, Bella,
Right.
and really wasn't sure. And interestingly, he is now the biggest advocate for employee ownership out
Amazing.
there. So
Yeah.
it's just lovely to going back to my early point, it is a journey for each individual
Mm-hmm.
on this process and so in those early days, and including myself, actually, we're all trying to figure out what this means for us. And um, from a leadership perspective, we absolutely went into it sort of really really intentional about trying to do it well
Mm.
and invest in embedding employee ownership into our culture.
Yeah.
Um, and what that must have felt like for the team was, what we wanted it to feel like was, oh no, things have changed around here. Yes, okay, Bella might still be in post. And my co-director and former owner, Andy, who was our former FD, he was also in post for a number of years. He's transitioned now to our chairman, so his role has changed. Um, so we really considered how can we make this feel different. So we appointed somebody new to the board.
Right.
Um, we sent a couple of people on good governance courses with the EOA. We introduced quarterly vision days to the business, which I think is probably um, one of the most meaningful differences that we've done since going employee owned, and in terms of the impact that they've had.
What do they look like, Bella?
They're quarterly,
Yeah.
half a day with the whole team, and they are. It's an evolving agenda. It's not like we always have the same agenda, but the sort of basic premise of these meetings is that we are there to look up and look forward together as a
Okay.
team. So, uh, you know, um, interestingly, I guess it was 3 years ago now, we introduced a 5-year goal, which is something that we continually revisit on these vision days. But the topics do change based on what's going on in the business at the time, or what we need to talk about. But they're always so positive. They're always so galvanizing. Everybody comes out with a spring in their step and
Yeah.
sort of feeling good about this business. So it's, as I say, it's like a board meeting, but for the
Mm.
whole team, really.
Yeah.
So really, just trying to to remind ourselves of where we're going, how we're going to get there, what do we need to do, and allowing people a voice in terms of that process.
That's exactly what I was thinking. That's a wonderful example of you do hear, and I speak with employee-owned businesses where they say, well, actually, there's not been a lot of change as a result of being employee-owned, and we'll maybe come on to that in a minute or two. But that's a real tangible opportunity for them to, as you say, think and act like owners and come up and shape strategy and vision and what have you. That's a lovely example. I guess that takes us nicely on to employee mindset, think like an owner, behave like an owner. And I'm interested in terms of if there are any particular practical examples or thoughts you've got to businesses that have maybe relatively recently transitioned in terms of how you, I guess, sort of inculcate that thinking around think like an owner. And subsidiary sort of question is, where does that start, that think like an owner? I was with a employee-owned business a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "Oh, we became employee-owned 2 years ago, and one of the challenges I've really had is changing people's thinking. This whole owner mindset. I've really struggled to impart it. It doesn't feel like we've changed much." And I said, how much as the leader of the business have you talked about what does that look like? I don't think when we become employee owned, people don't immediately walk through the door the following day thinking, I'm going to think like an owner, think like an entrepreneur. I think there's a degree to which it's got to be led.
Mm.
I'm just interested in how you've gone about that and whether you think you've made the progress perhaps you thought you would, or and are there examples? I mean, the one you've just given is a brilliant example of how you're really getting people to think in that owner mindset. But are there any other things you've done or introduced since you became employee owned where you think, yeah, we're really making good progress there that you could share with other people on the journey?
Yes, I think the vision days have been a great opportunity for us to get together and have basically grown up conversations. Um, and we're very lucky. We have an incredible team, and they are all senior. So we're not, and we're all in a close enough location where we can get together frequently. So there's a number of barriers that are removed in terms of conversations which are a bit more elevated.
Sure.
And I think the thing that really springs to mind is sharing information that is
Right.
both good and bad. So we share all financial information with the exception of individual salaries.
Hmm.
Um, and we have adopted, and I'm not saying we do this perfectly. We've adopted a much more a sort of communicative mindset as leaders of really trying um, to share as much as possible. And it might be that there are a number of initiatives that are leadership led. So, for example, we wrote a new business plan when we went employee owned. But before we signed it off, we put it in front of the team and we said, "Can we have your input?" And the same with the 5 year goal. So it may be leadership led, but it is much
Mm.
more of a consultative process. And I think this perhaps again goes back to that point I made earlier about this takes time.
Yeah,
And, you know, from one day to the next, everything has changed and nothing's changed in
sure.
terms of employee ownership, particularly when, in our case, leadership is still in post. Um, and so it is a gradual mindset shift. What we were lucky actually, and this was luck rather than design, at 4 months in, we were in a position to make a really good beneficiary payment. And we really agonized out over it actually, because we really, really didn't want employee ownership just to be about money. And we were like, oh, should we do this? Should we not? But actually, I'm really pleased that we did, because it was the first very tangible output of transitioning that people felt. And I think that it certainly kind of ignited that sort of spark of, oh no, things have changed. We've seen a number of different things culturally that have changed. I've had a chunk of money land in my bank
Yeah,
account. It's tax free.
yeah.
Okay, and I think that was, if I was to advise an employee owned business now, on transition,
Mm,
at all possible, I would say build in beneficiary payments along the way. And we've been really fortunate that we've been able to do that. But I think that's again, it's a huge symbolic aspect of being employee owned that helps that. But at the same time, it should never just be about that. So it is this
sure.
balance.
It's a balance. Yeah.
Mm,
One question I meant to ask a while ago, you were talking about how you'd got one of your team who was a bit of a skeptic, and now they are a real advocate, which is brilliant. I
mm.
always think in a EO business, certainly initially, if you can get a third of your team as really advocates, a third are really nice, looking forward to a bit of the profit share, and a third you've got to sort of drag along, and then gradually you adjust that percentage as you go. Uh, I came across another business the other day where they haven't gone down the EO route at the moment because they have got one person who's just going, I'm just not sure it's right for us and right for the business. Without, again, uh, share what you will around the circumstances you went through, but were there any particular sticking points that you've experienced in that? Was it a lack of understanding, or what was it that then this person went, do you know what, I now get it? Was there any particular catalyst for that light bulb moment of change and acceptance, would you think?
That's a really good question. I'd like to ask him actually, but
Okay.
my hunch would be s- meeting other employee-owned businesses and speaking to others in the same shoes. That would be my, because again, it's 4.5 years ago, so it's quite a long time ago now. Um, but well, I think potentially it's also seeing that we have we have made change in the
Mm,
business. So it's not lip service.
mm,
There is new person on the board. There is a new process for sharing information. There's a new an even more inclusive culture in terms of, or perhaps you know we often say we had a democratic culture before, and we still have a democratic culture now, but it's kind of elevated. It's more democratic. But
mm.
at the same time, we're not a democracy,
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
So
yeah.
there's a lot of grey area here. But if I think back to that intentionality that we had of being good at employee ownership,
Mm,
of embedding it in our culture and making it feel like there was a change in the business, potentially coupled with meeting others, perhaps even meeting others that hadn't done as much of that, and so a recognition of, oh no, actually, we do a good job in this area. I That would be my assessment.
great. Thank you. As the current incumbent CEO in the business, do you think, I'm thinking particularly of Philippa in Paradigm Norton, where she came into a business that was employee owned. And one of the things I've been chatting to her about is the role of a CEO in an employee owned business different to the role of a CEO in a non EO business? What would you say about that? Have you had to adjust, pivot, change the way you lead the business now as a result of becoming employee owned? And what would you say to other CEOs making the change? What are I guess you've talked about the mindset shift, but what are the sort of practical things that you think you very much need to have on your radar agenda now as an EO business that perhaps wasn't the case before?
I think it is different, actually,
Mm.
being a leader of an employee-owned business, and I think it's much more about, in a way, sort of servant leadership.
Hmm.
I think you have, it's likely that a business will have a team of people that do feel, on the one hand, very engaged and passionate about that business, but on the other hand, I don't want to use the word entitled because there's negative connotations with that, and I don't
Sure.
mean it negatively, but
Yeah.
entitled to a say and they do, in terms of entitled to hear more, to have more information. Having said that, interestingly, I've recently met a couple of EO businesses who have quite large, let's say sort of 50, larger than us anyway,
Mm.
sort of 50 or so employees who are predominantly quite young.
Right.
And what I've heard from those two, they haven't necessarily been having a great time financially.
Okay.
Um, and their employees have almost said, actually, we don't want to know. You're
Oh,
leaders,
interesting.
you
Yeah.
deal with that stuff. We just
Mm.
want to get on and do our job. So I think it is individual to each business. But I would say, in general, as a leader of an EO business, there is a much higher obligation to share and consult
Yeah.
and consider the ideas, thoughts, feelings of your team, um, than perhaps a non-EO business, or perhaps let's just say a more traditional business.
Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago servant leadership, and I completely agree with you. What does that look like, or what do you mean by that in the context of salad? What does servant leadership look like?
I think it really is about thinking of others first.
Right.
It's about always thinking about those individuals in your business, um, how they're feeling, how they're progressing, um, and yeah, putting their needs above yours. And I think that again is quite a cultural thing that I mean, it sounds quite, in a way lofty or altruistic. And I think that it isn't always the case, because sometimes that does mean making difficult decisions that people won't be happy with, but always for the greater good of the business. Maybe it's actually putting the business first rather than the people. Uh, and but it is a culture of care,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know you all that well, but from the time we've got to know each other, it very much feels like that's you. That's how you operate as a leader. So yeah, no, I can completely get that. We're going to just come on to a few shorter questions, but is there anything that you think in our conversation so far? We talked earlier about, I guess, us and you a little bit stepping into the unknown. We didn't really know who to go to in terms of professional advisors. The market's matured and it's quite different now, thankfully. But are there any other tips or thoughts that you'd give to a business that's thinking of becoming employee owned that we haven't covered thus far, in terms of things you've picked up along the way, maybe ideas you've garnered as a result of being now two independent trustees? What's missing in our conversation? Is there anything else you think it would be pertinent for us to discuss quickly?
I can't think of anything that's missing. I think that we've covered really the key point in terms of that topic, which would be to speak to others. I think we've covered that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. Um, what's the most important bit of advice? If you were to give one bit of advice to someone going EO, what would it be?
undoubtedly speak to others in the same shoes. Speak
O-
to others who've done it,
Okay.
and that you will learn so much, and try and get a cross section. of different businesses at different stages in the journey. And as I've mentioned, the employee ownership community is so incredibly generous. And the stories are fascinating. And I think, particularly as a leader, there is something about leader to leader conversations, full stop,
Sure.
that are so rewarding. But
Yeah.
when you add the layer of employee ownership on top of that, I think they are really meaningful and high quality conversations.
Brilliant. Um, I need to think of a better word for this, but how do you prevent the novelty? And it's the novelty word that I quite like. Of you go through this transition, it all feels great. 2 or 3 years later, how do you keep that momentum going in an EO business? That sense of owner mindset when, yeah, the initial excitement, I guess, has dissipated somewhat.
I think it's about that it's the constant investment in little things. Perhaps is belittling that investment, but relatively, ongoing constant investment in terms of your employee ownership culture, recognizing that things are always changing. You need to keep communicating, keep listening to
Hmm.
people. What's been interesting about Salad is, I think it was probably sort of 3.5 years in that our team kind of shifted a gear in terms of
Right.
their voice. Um, and and as leadership, we needed to make some changes based on that. So it does feel like it will be very individual to a business, but don't think it's kind of these big grand gestures or big grand investments that necessarily always everything you need to do. It can be little and often. Potentially that's more effective than anything.
Yeah. Thinking back in the last 6 months, you've shared really helpfully around your quarterly vision days. And I really like the idea of how you've embraced those and brought other people in. You've talked about very open communication and shared financial information. Is there anything else you've done in the last 6 months to keep that sort of fresh perspective of employee ownership? Anything that you've um, either you or a team members come up with that you've thought, actually, that's a really good idea. We should initiate that. Any new stuff that you've come up with relatively recently?
The thing that springs to mind, and it might not be recent, but actually I realise we haven't spoken about this, is one of the things that we did do relatively early on, perhaps because I and we had never spoken to other EO businesses pre-transition. And when we started to speaking to others, we realised the value in it.
Hmm.
But we started putting on employee ownership networking events.
Okay.
And so we called them South Coast EO Networking. And we held them in our office. They've always been very informal and casual. We've kind of mixed it up with different formats. Sometimes we've had a speaker or a panel. Sometimes it's just been pure networking. But one of the things, I think, one of the really great benefits of that initiative was what our team got out of it.
Right.
I think quite often we might have a conference or an event and we'll send some people to that. You're not going to send your whole team. But by holding our own events and inviting others who are at all sorts of different stages of their EO journey, from pre-transition to early stages to mature, um, it's allowed our team to network and meet others in the space. And I think that's been a real advantage, actually, in terms of that engagement and pride
Yeah.
in being employee owned and being part of the community.
Yeah, and I definitely echo that. We've been to all sorts of EO events and various things, and whenever you just meet other people, there's always amazing stuff you can learn. And I remember in the early days going to the EOA conference, which was great. The sessions are really good, but it's sometimes just the casual conversations around the dinner table or whatever it might be, where we were thinking about, how big should the trust board be? Who should we have on it? And then you've got the benefit of 10 other people who go, oh, we did it this way. And you think, yeah, that's tremendous. So no, completely agree. So that's really helpful. Few quick fire, bringing the podcast to an end questions. Employee ownership is, in one sentence,
Okay,
or
so
finish the sentence.
I'm going to get philosophical on you now. So for
Perfect.
me, employee ownership is an antidote to a world that is heading towards irreversible wealth inequality.
Love
And I think
that.
that, yeah.
You didn't think of that up on the moment. I can tell you've been asked that one before. Excellent. My biggest EO surprise was,
How much I have loved becoming part of the employee-owned community.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, likewise. One book every aspiring owner should read. Now, it doesn't have to be a employee ownership book. I don't know how many copies of Die with Zero we hand out. I've talked to you about Die with Zero.
I love Die with Zero.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great book. Great
Yeah,
book.
amazing.
Not, sort of financial planning, very pertinent for employee owned businesses. But is there a book that's not Die with Zero that you've really loved and embraced and would recommend to others?
Yes, Radical Candor.
Okay. Yeah.
Have you read it?
I have.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's really about communication, about how and actually sort of difficult conversations, giving feedback, but the benefit that brings in doing it, and to not shying away from those conversations.
Sure. Nearly there. Final bit is what we call CEO confessional. This is your opportunity to share a moment of honesty, an unfiltered story, or a secret struggle. Have you got one for us?
Yeah, mine is the secret struggle.
Okay, go for it.
And it is, I want to leave, but I don't want to leave.
Okay. Yeah.
And I mean, I think we've touched on it earlier, but it's that sort of like, I love this business, but I've sold it to employee ownership because I want the opportunity to do other things. But also be careful what you wish for, Bella.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because actually I do love what I do and this business. So yeah, that is my secret struggle.
Thank you for sharing that, honestly. And it's not for today's podcast to resolve that for you. All I would say is reaching out for me to someone outside the business to be able to give a completely independent perspective was immensely helpful and helped me through that journey. So I can either share with you offline who I spoke to, but I definitely encourage you to look to others. Wonderful. That's been such a joy to share some of your journey. The whole idea of the Steak and Soul podcast is really to do that, to speak to, certainly in series 1, is to speak to other CEOs. So, we can all build amazing EO businesses and just share best practice. And you've been really generous in your sharing your thoughts with me today. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Barry.